Hey, it's Chris. Should you get an iPad Pro or a MacBook Pro? I want to think a little bit differently about this today. So this isn't going to be a huge spec comparison or anything like that. It's going to be a lot more practical. But let me just preface this video by saying that personally, I've been developing a bit of a Mac bias recently, meaning I've found myself starting to gravitate towards the Mac when it comes down to doing things, getting things done. And as I was thinking about why that might be the case, this video was born. Now, I'm gonna tell you a little bit more about why I think that might be the case later on in this video. But first, I think it's worth contemplating what it is that makes each of these devices pro in the first place, because figuring that out in your own head is gonna go a long way towards helping you solve which one makes the most sense for you. So first things first, I think there's actually two types of pro here. There's pro to you, the type of work that you do, the apps that you need, the environment you're in. And then there's also pro in general, the stuff that matters to everybody, the specs. So in either case, pro to you or pro in general, I think what we're really talking about here is the removal of limits, right? That's what you're paying extra for here when you get a pro iPad or pro Mac versus a non-pro device. You're paying for the removal of limits. So you gotta figure out which of these devices is gonna remove the most limits, both in general and for your work specifically. And there's a lot more to it than just the specs and things like benchmarks. All right, so in talking about what makes these devices pro in your context, I think consideration number one is what you can do with them. And then number two, just as importantly, is how you go about doing whatever it is you need to do. So if there's something that you need to get done and one of these devices doesn't do it, that's a deal breaker. For instance, if you need to be able to sketch and handwrite and use an app like Procreate, then the MacBook Pro is gonna be off the table. But on the other hand, if you need to be able to use Logic and Xcode and Final Cut Pro or similar apps, or some serious science or CAD or academic apps, then it's the iPad that's gonna be out. But there are some areas of overlap where both of these devices are gonna be able to do the same or similar things. And in that case, it really comes down to, well, what is it like to actually do those things? And I think this really comes down to productivity on the one hand, and then enjoyability on the other. Just for a simple example, you're gonna be able to take notes on both of these devices, but do you enjoy handwriting more using a stylus, or do you prefer to type? So if you had to pick, handwriting is nice, but it's not necessarily necessary. And it's slower. So you may enjoy it, but at the end of the day, productivity, getting stuff done, is gonna end up trumping enjoyability. It reminds me of a common discussion in the startup world, and that is vitamins versus painkillers. Vitamins can be nice, they can add a little bit to your experience, to your life, but if you're having a pain, you don't need a vitamin. You're gonna not even consider a vitamin, you're gonna go straight to the painkiller. So a painkiller isn't just nice, it's actually necessary. And within this iPad Pro versus MacBook Pro debate, you really don't wanna end up with something that's actually more of a pain for your workflow. So it's important to really think things through. In other words, technically being able to get something done is one thing, but having to use a bunch of workarounds or things like shortcuts, which is cool that you can do that, is a completely separate thing. The iPad Pro is actually more powerful than it's ever been, but at the same time, it's still more limited in many areas than the Mac. For instance, it can now hook up to an external display, which is awesome, very cool, but you can only have 4 active apps or windows up on the display at a time. Is that enough for you? Of course, it goes both ways. You can't just rip the screen of the Mac off and start tapping away, and when you're done, put the keyboard back on and start typing away. So my advice to you is to spend some serious time thinking about your workflows before you make a purchase. What is a workflow? It's really simple. A workflow is data in, data processed, and data out. So apply that mentality, go through the process. What is it that I do? How do I get that information in onto the device? What do I do with it? And how am I gonna get it out? Use it for something. So just as an example, let's say you're a photographer and you're gonna edit some photos, okay? And you wanna get the photos onto the device. Well, the MacBook or the iPad could benefit from having stuff airdropped, but the MacBook Pro here has an SD card slot, data in. On an iPad Pro, if you wanna import from an SD card, you either need a hub or a dongle. Then you also have full Photoshop with plugins and all over here on the Mac. On the iPad side of things, you're gonna use something like Affinity Photo, and the iPad tends to often limit things like the maximum number of layers that you can have open in an app at any given time. Some apps top out at like 64 layers. So if you're doing some professional, seriously intense type of work, which these are the machines that you're looking at, right? these things can matter. And then of course, there's file management, which is still pretty different on the iPad and the Mac, even though they look kind of similar now and you can do a lot on the iPad that you could do on the Mac for a long time. There's still a few things that might just be a thorn in your side that you might be used to or be able to do over here that you just can't do quite yet over here. On a related note, since we're talking about getting things done here, I am in the middle of producing a productivity course for Apple users. So if you want to be able to work faster, better, and with less burnout within the Apple ecosystem, there's a form down in the description where you can give me your email and I won't spam you. I'll just ping you when the course is live so that you don't miss out when that launches. Also, inevitably, somebody asks, what's the wallpaper? Where can I get it? I will link up the wallpaper down in the description. These are from the Daily Tech Wallpaper Pack Supernovae, so you can check that out as well. And actually, I'm gonna be giving away a couple of wallpaper packs in the next issue of the newsletter, so if you're not signed up, you can get signed up in the description as well. It's a good idea because it automates the discovery of cool apps and accessories for your Apple products, just puts it on autopilot. Comes out every Friday. So now let's talk just briefly about the specs because they do impact what you can do on these devices. And mostly what the specs do is affect how intensely you can do whatever work can actually be done on each of these devices, which is really a question of What I mean is, versus the Airs, the MacBook Air and the iPad Air, the Pros have all different kinds of They're faster, the screens are brighter. And between these two Pros here, there are plenty of as well, but the rule of thumb is that the Mac is basically going to outspec the iPad Pro in any overlapping department. Now, the iPad Pro has the Apple Pencil and a modular form factor, right? So it can shapeshift. It can be a liquid, a solid, or a vapor, whatever you want. That's literally what it has over the MacBook Pro. It has a stylus and modularity. That's it. Now, the Apple Pencil can be a huge advantage, especially when paired with the paper-like screen protector. Love that. And it can be nice to not have to drag a keyboard around with you everywhere that you go. But in every other way, the iPad Pro is more limited. It has less power, it has less ports, some key apps are either missing like Xcode or dumbed down like Microsoft Office, and even the Magic Keyboard is missing that top row of function keys there. So a modular form factor and a dedicated form factor both have advantages and disadvantages. And in many ways, I feel like it's breadth, the iPad Pro, versus depth, the MacBook Pro. And it's kind of like that old saying, you can be a jack of all trades, but it might make you a master of none. The iPad is very good at a lot of things, but the Mac is great, the best, at some things that are key things that matter in certain professional settings. Now, one thing that doesn't really matter, but it's sort of tangentially related, is optics. How do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as a pro? Do you want other people to recognize you as a pro when you're around them? Could you be a pro if you get these in the future? I feel like it's really not worth buying either of these just for the optics, because at that point, it's really no different than just buying a luxury car for the optics, right? Maybe a luxury car is gonna be faster, but where are you gonna use that speed in the real world? And it's gonna be cooler, but who's really gonna see it? These I'm talking about in the real world. If you're just buying it for the optics, you're really just buying it for how it makes you feel, which I guess could be valid to some people, but at the same time, just feeling professional doesn't make amateur activities suddenly non-amateur. If you're using these in a professional setting, you're using them to support your career, to make money. These aren't really intended as hobbyist machines, although nothing's gonna stop you from buying this if you really wanna spend the money, right? And it's just, you wanna have the latest, greatest thing. I mean, at the end of the day, these really are tools, and it's what you do with the tools, what you can do with the tools that really matters in a professional setting, right? And in a professional setting, it's not just, hey, look at this really awesome hammer. No, it's what did you build? What can you build with that hammer? All right, so let me aim the ship back at the harbor and try to bring this full circle. I opened the video by talking about my new recently found Mac bias, the fact that I'm gravitating towards the Mac when it's time to get stuff done. I think for me, the MacBook Pro is simply less limiting for the type of work that I'm doing, despite the iPad's modularity and the Apple Pencil. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't like the iPad Pro. In fact, I love the iPad Pro. It doesn't mean that I don't want to use it, right? I would hate to be without this thing and to not have it as a tool and as an option. But at the end of the day, when these two things are both sitting there in a room, I both consciously and subconsciously think of the iPad Pro here as the support device. And here's where the rubber really meets the road, if I'm being honest about these two devices in my own life. If Pro means I use a device to support my profession, my career, well, if I lost the MacBook Pro, my business would be severely impacted. If I lost the iPad Pro here, if it evaporated, my business, it would live on. It would be all right. And it's that realization that kind of says it all for me personally. Now, an artist is gonna feel very differently. So context matters. So the MacBook Pro, I can kind of declare the winner of this battle if I had to put them head to head in my own life. It's vitamins versus painkillers. And it could come out differently in your own workflow. My main goal in making this video though, was to help you think through the process and know what questions to ask, what things to think about before you actually pull the trigger on either of these. And of course, if you can get them both, the more the merrier, right? These work so well together. If you're new around here, there's a podcast. It's the Daily Tech Podcast. I'll link it up for you. We'll continue this discussion, talk over some of the comments and stuff there. Also, don't forget to sign up for that newsletter so you can put your app and accessory discovery on autopilot. Thanks for hanging out today, and I'll catch you in the next video. Later.